You've just entered the no delusion zone. I'm David Dubato. Today, my very special guest is Nicolas Tenzer. Nicolas is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, and chairman of the Center for Studies on and Research on Political Decision. Nicolas is currently a guest professor at Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po, and France's Institute for Advanced Studies on National Defense. His current interests and writings are heavily focused on political risk analysis, European issues, Russia and Ukraine, disinformation warfare, the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, and corruption. Nicolas is the author of 22 books, including Political Philosophy, The World in 2030, The Rule and the Disorder, France Needs Others, and he is the author of over 1,000 scientific papers and op-eds. In June of 2021, Nicolas founded Tenzer Strategies, where he regularly publishes insights on foreign and security policy. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the No Delusion Zone, Nicolas Tenzer. Welcome, Nicolas.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for welcoming me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I would like to start actually with discussing an article, and I said this to you off air, that you recently had published in the Kyiv Post. And the title of this article is When the West's Stupidity Prevents Ukraine's Victory. I've used similar phrases over the last almost 3 years in terms of the support from NATO, including the United States. And well, I won't use the word refreshing because this is a negative issue, but I'm very glad that someone such as yourself feels pretty much the same way. If you could, Nicolas, tell us about this article, why you wrote it, and what it says.
Well, basically, I had a feeling of despair because basically we could have helped Ukraine to win already, I would say, in 2014 and certainly in 2022. And because we hadn't the willingness to do so, and by we, I mean the allies, I mean not only the US, but also most of the European countries, because of that, we lost ground in the face of basically Russian willingness to destroy Ukraine, but also to sabotage the world order. And also, we gave also, through this way, a great power of China, which is maybe not the ally of Russia, but still, which benefit from the West undecisiveness and the West lack of resolve. I said that we could have helped Ukraine very much. First of all, we could have prevented certainly more than 100,000 people to die. And I think we have to consider the victims of our own willingness not to intervene. I remember on February 24th, 2022, I appeared in, 10 TV shows. And I said, we have to take action. We, the West, we have to take action. We immediately have certainly not necessarily to send boots to the grounds, but at least through the airstrikes of our own missiles, we could have certainly, and it was according to the Article 5 of the 51 of the UN Charter, we could have certainly just struck the Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. We could have done that. And then it would have been a good signal to Russia not to go further. And instead of that, remember the first days of the invasion of Ukraine, we said maybe, Zelensky has to go. We will offer him political asylum or whatever. And finally, of course, we will impose a lot of sanctions to Russia. But at the end of the day, what would have been the consequence of that? It would have been some months after that the West could have said, well, finally we'll go back to Moscow, we'll try to re-engage Russia, and all this kind of stuff. And I think that was the kind of bullshit that I was observing since actually at least 2008, when the US and the West didn't take action after the invasion of Georgia. We didn't take action also, in 2013 after the chemical attacks, on the Ghouta by the Syrian regime. We didn't take action in 2014. We didn't take action during the siege and then the fall of Aleppo in Syria, and in 2022. So basically, we have show a lack of resolve, and certainly it was not going unnoticed by the Russian regime, but also by most of the Western allies, not only, I mean, in Europe, but also in Asia, and encourage basically Russia and China, well, to say, finally, the West is weak, so we can re-engage with countries inside Europe, like Hungary and Slovakia, or with Serbia, also in Europe, not in the EU, or some other countries. And I think that's a very bad signal given by the West. And still, 3 years after, that's why I wrote this piece. 3 years after, where are we? We are nowhere. We are nowhere. You still have, I mean, Ukraine, occupied. 20% of the Ukrainian territory is still occupied by the Russian forces, and we know perfectly that all the occupied zones of Ukraine, day after day, we are witnessing collective rapes, summary executions, torture, deportation of children, which is a crime of genocide according to the conventions of December 9th, 1948. Well, that's absolutely where we are now. I don't know, we could discuss after that about, what could be the Trump's presidency, of course, and the decision made by Trump on Ukraine. But certainly we are in a very bad position. And the only one, and I will just finish, with that, the only one who are of great lucidity about the future of security in Europe are the Ukrainians. And these Ukrainians have shown since day one the willingness to resist. And right now, just observe what they are doing. And that's some things that I witnessed by my own eyes when I went to Ukraine. I went 5 times to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. They have great capabilities. They are inventive. They are able basically to give lessons to the West in terms of manufacturing drones and missiles. And certainly, I think that this so-called small country, and Ukraine is not a small country, in fact, these small countries can give lessons to the world.
I totally agree with you, Nicolas. I've written and spoken several times over the last 3 years about the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people. Not just the bravery, like you were saying, the inventiveness, what they're doing, what they have done with their military, with their scientific advancements, with just everything that they've been doing. They have become the beacon for Western democracies. Yeah. They really have. And coming from an American, that's embarrassing, but it's just a fact. Let's get back to your article just for a moment, because again, you said the West's stupidity, and I agree with you. However, I've also used other words in talking about the West's inability to supply Ukraine with all the tools they need, not only just to defend themselves, but to defeat Russia. And I've used words such as cowardice and corruption. I believe that the Western leaders, not all of them, certainly not the ones in the East, Poland, the Baltics, but Western European leaders are cowards. I'm sorry, they are. They don't want to confront this. They don't want to confront their own people, Nicolas. This is a lack of political will. And you've said this many, many times. They have the ability to ramp up their manufacturing base to wartime levels if they wanted to, and to rebuild their ammunition stocks and their military over a fairly short time, but they lack the political will. They are afraid to confront their citizens and tell them what it will take in terms of budget and money to do this. Also, I'm throwing 2 concepts out here now, corruption and cowardice. Many of these leaders, and certainly the CEOs of Western corporations, still have their fingers in the pie in Russia. This is a lot of money to them, and they are still loath to cut their business ties with Russia. This is disgusting. It's just horrible. But would you address those 2 factors, cowardice and corruption, in terms of the lack of NATO support?
I think that's something that I wrote extensively in my last books, which was All Wars, that was published, at the beginning of 2024. I addressed two things. It's of course about the questions of cowardice. There's also a questions of unwillingness, absolutely, but that's also a questions about lack of intelligence. Which is part, I mean, the question of the stupidity that was, in the title of my essay, because I think they still are in the mood of saying, well, you have great powers, and only the great powers politics is the only thing that at the end of the day has a kind of value, which is absolutely not true. The fact is that you have small nations and middle-sized nations who are more able today to cope with the real threats than very big countries like the US, like France, like Germany, certainly, maybe the UK up to a certain point. The UK is a little bit different. But I think that's a lack of understanding of the very nature of the war. They do not want to address the fact that the war waged by Putin is a war of extermination. It's an all-out war. It's not a territorial war, but they are still thinking, many of them, like, well, it was a war like the kind of wars that we have in the 16th or 17th or 18th century. They still have, they do not understand that the war that Putin is waging is, in fact, the kind of war that Hitler was waging in 1939. And that we have, because of that, to have a very clear aim, a war aim, I would say, which is basically to defeat Russia. And they do not want to address the questions of defeating Russia. They are still afraid of that. And I was working, extensively as well on the Russian propaganda. Of course, you have two kinds of propaganda. You have hard propaganda about, the so-called Nazis in Kiev, about the fact that NATO is a threat. I mean, all this stuff is absolutely utter nonsense. But you have also soft propaganda. And I remember I was, in the Vilnius NATO summit in July 2023, and we had the opportunity to discuss with Jake Sullivan, at that time, the national security advisor to President Biden. And he said, well, we have to prevent a war between NATO and Russia. And we said, well, that's not the point. No one wants a war between NATO and Russia. The fact is that if there is a kind of conventional war between NATO and Russia, certainly NATO, ultimately will win. There is no point about that. We can certainly dissuade Russia, we can deter Russia, and we could have done that at the very early stage of the war. And the second narrative that we hear quite often, if we confront Russia, there will be World War III, there will be a kind of, nuclear apocalypse or something like this, which is basically, and I studied that, something that I mentioned in my last book as well, all the narratives by the Russian guys around Putin, since many years, not since 2022. They were always, advancing that. And the fact is that during 25 years, the West has deterred itself because of this lack of intelligence. They do not know about the ideology of Putin. They do not know about all the roots of Putin's ideology that borrows, of course, to Eurasianism, but also to Nazism. Remember, Putin had decided to repatriate to Russia the ashes of Ivan Ilyin, who was a Russian Nazi terrorist. I mean, it speaks volumes about the very nature, of Russian regime. And the very idea that we could coexist with Russia as it is now is absolutely nonsense. I mean, that's the first thing, which is lack of intelligence. The second point about corruption that you addressed rightly, in my view, is you should have many, many CEOs, of course, in the West and partly in the US as well, I must say, who consider basically that Russia is mostly a very lucrative market. They could do business with it, which is completely wrong. I remember there was a very big bank in France who decided to invest in Russia already in 2005. And I speak with some of the leaders of this bank, and I said to them, I mean, it's completely misleading because of the state of corruption, because Putin doesn't want to have a middle class So the very idea that you could basically sell mortgages, to the Russian people is completely wrong. And because of the geopolitical uncertainties, and it was in 2005. And at the end of the day, this bank has lost 800 million euros, in Russia. And after that, they came back. And they came back it was in 2019, and they stayed there. And then in 2022, they lost more than 1 billion euros also in Russia. So I think it's not a very good business, in fact. And the second thing is, I am very angry about also the some of the European and governments, and also sometimes the US government. You still have businesses doing, doing some profits, in Russia. We have, of course, good sanctions, and I think the sanctions bite Russian economy. Of course, that's good, but we do not have enough. Just see, of course, that in Europe, Russia is still selling LNG. And I think it's absolutely not normal. You still have a lot of consideration of sanctions, also through Central Asia. And through Central Asia, you have some European companies and US companies still trading with Russia. And I think we are absolutely not serious. That's a kind of, we are undermining our own security because we are not willing to take very strong measures against Russia. Remember, you have some good sanctions about, Gazprom Bank, issued by the US government. But the EU government, the EU as such, and the EU member states haven't issued such kind of sanctions against Gazprom Bank because they still consider that it could be very useful for the trades that they still have with Russia. And that's intellectual corruption. I'm not talking about corruptions. You have some corrupt guys, of course, whom we know perfectly. But that's a kind of intellectual corruptions. And that speaks a lot about the influence of some business circles to the European governments.
Nicolas, and I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you almost totally. But let me ask you this, because I don't have an answer myself. The leaders of Western Europe are very intelligent individuals. These aren't people who just woke up one day on the street and find themselves as prime ministers or presidents of their countries. They're very intelligent people. Why, till today, in January of 2025, do they still not understand the threat of Putin's Russia to them, to Europe?
Well, I think it's a difficult issue because I think on the one hand, they understand. If we consider some of the declarations made or statements made by Emmanuel Macron or the German Minister of Defense or some others, they basically consider that Russia is a long-term threat. But on the other hand, they are not acting as if it was a real threat. That's a kind of cognitive dissonance. And I think the question of the cognitive dissonance is one of the more difficult points to address. Let's consider some of the leaders, including my president, it was last year, said, well, we are not at war with Russia. In fact, Russia is at war with us. And because of that, we have to take very strong measures. We were talking just previously about the needed increase of the military spendings in Europe. And I remember Emmanuel Macron, the French president, talking as early as June 2022 about the need for the EU countries to enter into war economy. He was right, but we didn't. For me, that's a very difficult point because if we want really to spend more and then to make very difficult decision for the public opinion in the EU country, it means basically we have to increase the military spendings. It makes, of course, that we have to diminish because of the budget deficits that in France we have, but in other countries as well. We have to diminish some other spendings. If there is absolutely no dramatic speeches day after day by those leaders about the real state of the threats posed by Russia and also China, I must say, uh, it will be very difficult to convince the public opinion, because if one day we say, well, we will have to go to sacrifice some of the, let's say, social spendings because we have to increase the budget, the people will say, I mean, the people, in the street will say, well, why? They never talk about that. And that's why, the title of my last book was Our War, because basically the wars that we have basically to fight, no one has ever won a war by leading from behind. We cannot win a war through proxies. And still, you have some of the European leaders considering Ukraine as a proxy. In fact, they are fighting for us, for our own security. They are saying so, in fact, and they're right.
I still find it incredible that the vast majority of the leaders of Western Europe have the inability to be honest with their own people, their own citizens, and tell them the existential danger that is just around the corner for the rest of Europe should Putin be victorious in Ukraine, or even, and we can talk about this in a moment, even if a less than desirable peace is arranged in Ukraine, which leaves Russia in control of the current approximately 20% of Ukraine, demilitarizes the Ukrainian army and military, and ensures that Ukraine will never join NATO. Even if that happens and there's no more bullets flying, that gives Putin time to rearm. He will go on to the rest of Europe, whether it's first through Moldova and Transnistria, through the Baltics, then Poland, whatever. And again, the leaders of Western Europe are intelligent people. They get intelligence reports from their people. The Kremlin is saying very, very often what their plans are post-Ukraine, that they're going into Europe. I find it astonishing that at this point, they still can't be honest with their people. Cognitive dissonance. You're absolutely right. I don't get it. And I just want to say one more point on this. Not too long ago, I think you're talking about Pistorius, the defense minister from Germany. He made an assessment, or the Defense Department did in Germany, that if there was a full-scale war against Russia tomorrow, they would have approximately 3 weeks worth of ammunition, including artillery shells, and then they'd run out. Again, this is just staggering to me. Knowing that now that that's all they have, and they're probably one of the better equipped, aside from Poland and some others, why? Why hasn't that been addressed? I don't get it.
No, I don't get it either. I think I couldn't agree more with what you were just saying. And for me, I quite often say to some of the leaders of Europe whom I know, please do not talk about negotiations or peace talks. Just refrain doing it. I think it's absolutely utter nonsense to consider that we could negotiate anything with Putin. I mean, it's just another, because as you rightly say, I mean, Russia will continue, and basically the end of the war or ceasefire or whatever you name it, uh, it's not peace. There could be no peace with Russia as long as Russia is not fully defeated and brought to its knees. And I think that's something that we have certainly to understand. And just imagine that right now you have a ceasefire imposed by Trump, and finally the EU agree with the ceasefire. And because there is no US guarantee, they won't send troops to Ukraine just to assure, to ensure the stability and the security of the Ukrainian people. Of course, Putin will rearm. Today Russia in a very bad shape. I mean, of course, it devotes more than 8% of the GDP to military spending, probably more 10 than 8, and that create a lot of sacrifices also for the Russian people. We know that, I mean, since a long time, that of course all the infrastructures, I mean, the roads, the schools, the trains, etc. That's basically in shambles right now in Russia. But also, no, you have also the military, the defense industry, which is suffering a great deal because also of the sanctions and the lack of course, I mean, sustainable economy in general. I'm not saying, of course, that Russia will fall down right now, but I think in 2 or 3 years, I mean, the situation will be certainly more difficult for Russia if we maintain the pressures, if we don't give up. And I think we could, and Ukraine, first of all, could defeat Russia. But let's imagine there is a kind of peace deal. Then Russia will say, okay, we will rearm. We will take our time. We have the time for us. And just imagine that there is a lifting of some of the sanctions. It will be a kind of godsend for Russia. And also a good signal for China. But even, and I will go further, even if there is a peace deal, and if we have NATO troops, in Ukraine, or of course that will be a coalition of the willing, maybe not under the umbrella of NATO or the EU, well, we'll see. Even there, if we consider that, well, we could accept that part of the Ukrainian territory remains captured by Russia, we will send a very bad signal also to the other countries because the signal will be, well, finally, I mean, the force, could pay, and the breach of law could pay, and international law has being, is completely meaningless and insignificant and has no values. And that's pure hypocrisy from the West to talk about international law, about human rights, etc. And I mean, that will be even like this. It will be a kind of catastrophe because it will show that the life of the people, the value of each life, in this case, Ukrainian lives, finally doesn't matter. And that's something that I'm quite often saying also to some of the leaders, in the EU, saying, first of all, you have to speak not only about the war, but you have to speak day after day about the crimes committed by Russia. You have to talk about the crimes. And you have 4 categories of crimes. You have war crimes, you have crimes against humanity, you have crime of genocide, and you have crime of aggressions. All crimes that are punished according to international law, which are, I mean, the most important legacy of the Nuremberg trial. And I think right now what the West is doing is basically to destroy this Nuremberg heritage, which is, for me, even personally, I would say, a kind of personal value.
It's disgusting. I mean, we're going through a trauma right now in America, and I'll get to that in just a moment as well. But Nicholas, the Russia is at war with us. We don't realize it in the West that we're at war. At least we don't acknowledge it. I mean, my God, fairly recently, Putin passed new laws and regulations that even children in kindergarten, 6-year-olds on up, are studying military, not tactics, but they're studying weapons and how to assemble and disassemble Kalashnikovs, which used to be during the Soviet Union reserved for high school students. Now it's already down to kindergartners. They are singing hymns and songs from the military and past wars. They are taking part in wartime parades as they would have during the Soviet Union times. And if anyone speaks out, well, God forbid, they're in a lot of trouble. I'm talking from students to teachers to parents. We are at war with Russia. As you said, about, what is it, 8% or so of their GDP right now is going towards the war effort. And I think it's something like 40% of their budget is allocated to the military production. But the West still doesn't get this. Doesn't get this. Uh, I don't. Let me ask you this: under what conditions, in your opinion, should the West, including Ukraine, most importantly, accept any negotiated settlement other than a total victory for Ukraine and a defeat for the Russian military? Under what circumstances should Ukraine accept a peace settlement other than total victory?
Well, first of all, of course, that's up to the Ukrainian to decide.
Absolutely.
But I mean, from all the people I met, in Ukraine, each time I went there, and all the conversations that I still have, I mean, with the Ukrainian people, they do not consider that they have to surrender. One of the former Ukrainian MPs said recently something which is, in my view, really meaningful. They said, well, if we continue to fight, we will lose certainly dozens of thousands of our best people. If we accept basically to surrender or a kind of peace deal, we will lose millions of our people. And I think the Ukrainians understand perfectly what's at stake. So basically, they have to decide. But in my view, and especially for the Western leaders, they have to consider that there could be absolutely no peace agreement with Putin. But they have also to help Ukrainians more. And in my view, as I said before, they have to engage themselves in the fight against Russia. I'm not saying that they have to send, of course, hundreds of thousands of troops, with boots on the ground, but just consider also, I mean, the capabilities that we have, in terms of missiles, in terms of fighter jets. I think certainly we can defeat Russia if we are not afraid of doing so. And that's why, I mean, we have also to understand that if there is no defeat of Russia, all the young persons that you mentioned in Russia, because of the militarization of the society, because of the existence of the Putin Jugend, in Russia, they will never surrender. There must be, and that's something that I wrote extensively as well on the Russian opposition. Some of the people of the Russian opposition, or most of them, do not get, which is if there is no the kind of collective consciousness and guilt of crime, there will be no way out for the Russian people. Of course, I mean, it will take decades, and it took decades in Germany as well. I remember it was in the midst of the 50s. Karl Jaspers wrote a book about the collective guilt, and it's very important. But at the end of the day, we had to wait until the president's address. It was the president Richard von Weizsäcker at that time, in May 8th, 1985. So 40 years after, to accept that the German people were collectively guilty. Of course, in terms of, I mean, legal proceedings, probably hundreds of thousands of Russian people are really guilty of the crimes. But I think there is this kind of collective guilt. They have to understand also that I mean, Russia as such, because it was an imperial power, and because of many Russian, even in the oppositions, do not give it this belief of the kind of superiority of Russia, because of this kind of Russian nationalism, enshrined in their soul, that they have to completely change the mindset.
And that
For
cannot
me, I mean, the
happen.
Russian,
And
yes,
that cannot happen, like you said, unless Russia is defeated.
absolutely.
In Germany, as you said, it took decades, but that was after an utter defeat and surrender of Nazi Germany. If Russia is not defeated militarily, there will be no collective guilt. And you said
Absolutely.
it before, very important, Nicholas. If there's a negotiated settlement without a total Russian defeat, there will be no justice. The crimes, the many crimes in the categories that you just listed, will never be adjudicated. They will just go away, and whatever happens, because Putin will remain. The Russian system, as it is now, will remain, and all of those indictments and investigations will just eventually go away. So the only way that collective guilt of the Russian people can occur eventually, and justice be served for the incredible, innumerable crimes committed against the Ukrainian people, can only come with the total defeat of the Russian military.
Absolutely. And I think the question of justice for me is absolutely key. There is no peace without justice. Absolutely. And I mean, if justice is not served, not only, I mean, Putin will continue or the guys after him, I mean, all the Siloviki, who are basically in power because there is absolutely no chance that someone from the so-called liberal opposition will replace Putin or those guys. I mean, Putin will certainly continue. And also, in the mindset of the Russian people, there will be still the feeling that Russia is a great power and that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, the Baltic states are basically not existent countries. And I think that now we are rediscovering, I mean, the virtue of the Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian language with their own specificity. We are rediscovering that in those countries there were artists, there were painters, there were musicians, there were, novelists who have very important value. I mean, artistic value that was completely suppressed by the Russians' kind of neo-colonialism. And that those nations are very specific. There is no kind of brotherhood. I mean, also stupidity, between the Ukrainian and the Russian people. There is nothing like they call Slavic soul. I mean, you have, I mean, this all kind of narratives, brought by a kind of rosy romanticism about the great Russia that has certainly to disappear. And I mean, it will be also for the good of the Russian people at the end of the day. And I
I
think that,
agree.
but the real problem is, if
Yeah.
I
No,
may add,
please.
the real problem, and that's something that I address also in my book and also in some of my other pieces, is that neither in DC nor in the Western capitals you have a comprehensive Russian strategy. I mean, and by Russian strategy, I mean basically how to address in the long term the Russian problem. Not only, I mean, to solve the so-called crisis or to put an end to the war, but also what could be the long-term view, I mean, with Russia. What I fear the most is that there is also a kind of peace settlement, of course, that will never be addressed. And also that all, I mean, the company will jump again to do business with Russia, and then I mean Russia will remain like this. And what we have also to understand, and it's not only about Ukraine, because Russia is fighting horizontal wars. And in fact, I mean, the encroachments of Russia in the world is multifold. We have encroachment, of course, in Georgia, in Transnistria, in Belarus. We add in Syria, which is an example, that shows that Russia could be defeated. But we have that also in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Burma. And I think we have to think about the liberation of those countries by Russia. And also, when we consider the Central Asian countries, or some of them at least, they want also to be liberated from Russia and not to fall at the same time, into Chinese orbit. I mean, and that's why we have, I mean, by we, I mean, of course, the Western countries, are also not only from the West, but also Japan, South Korea, a like-minded country, also Australia, etc. We have certainly to prevent this kind of yoke by either Russia or China in those countries. And the spirit of liberation, I think, must be, at the very center of the agenda for the years to come.
Well, it's quite ironic you mentioned that, because just 2 days ago I interviewed the founder of the Free Russian Nations Forum, Oleg Magaletsky, who talked extensively about the occupied ethnic minorities and former independent nations that are part of the Russian Federation against their will. And he hopes that in the future, post Putin and post a dictatorship, whenever that happens, that some, if not most, of those formerly independent nations will again become independent. Because most people aren't aware that the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, as it currently exists today, is really a combination of forcefully put together little independent nations, who some of which were independent as recently as the early 20th century. So yeah, that's something that we, meaning the West, should have as a long-term strategy in addition to post Putin, whoever comes next. But that's part of our problem, as you know, Nicholas, is that we don't have a long-term strategy. In fact, we still in the United States and Europe don't have any strategy for what the end game is in Ukraine, and that's been part of the huge problem as to why we're here today.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember when I talked with one of the former, U.S. official, I asked him about, well, basically, do you know, is President Biden at the time is following very closely, what happened in Ukraine? And he told me, and that's very inside of you, he said no. Basically, he said to Jake Sullivan, no World War III. And that's all. And then, you had someone, Jake Sullivan, who has absolutely no, who is not accountable, I mean, before the people, in fact, who managed to guess about what President Biden was saying. But I mean, that's basically a short-term view. It's absolutely not a long-term view. And sometimes I discuss also with my counterparts or with some officials also in the EU. I'm not talking about the Baltic states or Nordic states who probably have a more comprehensive view about what we should do. They have no absolutely no long-term view about Russia. And if they have no long-term view, they have no plan and they have no war aims. And in my view, that's one of the key problem. And coming back to the question of stupidity, which was one of the title of the last piece that you very kindly mentioned, I mean, the question of the stupidity basically is expressed by this lack of ability uh, to plan something according to consistent objectives. And that's something that we learn in school, in all the school about strategy, even in private business, we learn that first of all, we must have a global vision, that we must have substantial objectives, then we must have the strategy, then we have to jump into policies. I mean, that's a kind, and then we have to discuss about the means to reach, I mean, the objectives that we have defined. I mean, all this kind of thing is about a plan. And nowhere I have seen this kind of plan. I must say, neither, I mean, about Russia nor about China as well.
Why
Uh,
is that, Nicholas? Why is that?
I mean, I still have myself a question mark about that. Why?
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, but that will be maybe that will bring me too far. But for me, I have studied philosophy and humanities, of course, before jumping into a civil servant career, and still was teaching philosophy. I mean, that's also about the humanities or what we call liberal arts that we learn in schools. Of course, it's not a guarantee, but when you have, I mean, pure managers instead of, I will say, thinkers, uh, then, of course, the perspective very short-sighted. They do not understand the questions of history, and sometimes, just to take an example, some were referring to Munich 1938. And I said, well, partly, of course, we can understand this example. But in fact, what we are living right now is worse. Because Daladier or Charbelain at that time uh, could not imagine, basically, what Hitler was preparing to do. Of course, there is the risk of wars that was documented. The Nazis' ideology, of course, was well documented by scholars, by journalists, researchers, etc. But they could not imagine what will happen. They could not imagine the concentration camps. They could not imagine, I mean, the Holocaust. They could not imagine, everything that happened next. But no, in 2022 or even in 2014, we know about Munich. We cannot say that we didn't know. Naivete basically is not allowed. And we have to think about, the kind of continuity of times and just remember what people said after Auschwitz, never again. But the never again became a mockery. Because I mean, most of the Western leaders behave only like, if they have only, hammers, all the issues look like basically nails. I mean, but that's exactly the same. They consider that, of course, they have, of course, this kind of hammer, but the hammer that they have is not the appropriate hammer. They do because they are not thinking, at the horizon of the all-out war. They want to reduce a difficult problem in making it not radical. Like if Putin was a kind of normality or Russia a kind of normal regime. And so they do not want to see. They do not want to see, I mean, what I call also in my book, the question of pure evil or radical evil. And the question of radical, no, you cannot do that's morality. No, I said, no, it's not morality. It's fact. And they do not want to understand that, I mean, radical evil is not a question of morale. It's a question of reality. Sorry, I'm talking about in philosophical.
No. I think you've hit
But in my view, that's exactly the kind of explanations that's all about mindset.
Yeah.
That's all about, I was mentioning cognitive dissonance, but the functioning of the mind, when something is too big for them, they reduce it as if it were a kind of small thing.
But you hit on, I think, the key problem, or one of the key problems in this whole issue about our leaders in the West and their failures. They are not people who have studied the humanities, for the most part, or liberal arts, philosophy, history, certainly. They are MBAs. They are business people, or what we call STEM, science people, none of which is bad. That's great. But when you don't have people who have, are steeped, have a background in the humanities, in critical thinking, in being able to take all the available relevant information and then put it all together, sift through it, and come up with a rational, appropriate answer or way forward. If you don't have that ability, which our leaders apparently don't, then you're not going to be able to make a plan. You're not going to be able to think strategically. You're not even going to be able to think morally, for the most part, philosophically, about the tragedies that are taking place in Ukraine. It boils down to numbers. It boils down to sometimes business, like we talked about. That's a key point. We don't have people who are trained, who have studied the humanities, the liberal arts. They're scientists. They're not even good scientists. They're business people. Trump's a business person. We haven't even talked about Trump. It all comes down to transactions. What's good? What's in this for me personally, or my country? If it's not going to make me richer, well, then the hell with you. Or as he said to Putin, do whatever the hell you want with the NATO countries that don't pay the 2%.
Well, first of all, my fear is that's basically that for Trump, well, we know it for sure, doesn't have any kind of sense of the rule of law. The rule of law, and of course, humanitarian law, international law in general, the questions of role-based augurs, one says, doesn't matter for him. And so basically, when the rule of law doesn't matter, the questions of the oppression of the people, the question of the suffering of the people, the questions of the domination doesn't matter. Just look, when Trump was mentioning about, well, we have probably to take back to take Greenland or to take back Panama, or maybe, of course, to that Canada has to become the 51st state of the US, all this kind of thing. He basically shows a kind of disrespect for international law. And if we consider that was the argument for Greenland, especially, that because of our own security interest, we have to take this territory, he's speaking like Putin or Xi Jinping with Taiwan. You see, there is a kind of logic, in the narratives. And the logic of the narratives as used by Trump is certainly not very reassuring. Because he could basically throw the Ukrainian people under the bus if he considers that there is no vital interest for the US and that Ukraine has no value. And that's why very, skillfully Zelensky mentioned, well, you have a big, you have a big reserves of lithium, we have a big reserve of raw materials in Ukraine, and certainly we could make a deal like this. It was very skillful. But for Trump, the very idea of we have to organize the world according to the law is something which is completely absent. That was certainly present in President Biden's mind, but basically he didn't act accordingly. Just remember in launch, and that's something that I welcome, the very idea of the community for democracy, not community of democracies, in fact, but community for democracy. But the outcome of this initiative was very tiny, to say the least, or inexistent. And I remember the very famous speech that President Biden gave on August 31st, 2021, after the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. He said, well, we have right now to solve all the problems with diplomacy, assistance, cooperation, etc. And that's not, the vision of the world as it is. So basically, Trump, certainly, if he understands that the questions of disrespect for humanitarian law, let's say, or the law of the border, in Ukraine, has an implications of terms of the strengths of the US. That if President Trump basically do not comply with the rule of law, then it will go against the US interest, then maybe it could move along. But, we have certainly to convince him, but the problem is that probably, the rational argument will trump that something completely different. But we certainly have to convince him and his advisors, but is he listening to his advisors, that it is the interest of a strong man, as he pretends to be, to defeat Russia. And if he considers that China is a threat, that Iran is a threat, and certainly he does, that we must not give an advantage to Putin's Russia. Otherwise, that will be perceived as a sign of weakness by Beijing or Tehran or Pyongyang.
No, you're absolutely right. He's a narcissist. He's fairly illiterate. He doesn't read anything. He gets his intelligence briefings in cartoon form. I don't know if you knew that. And that's true. He doesn't like to read anything, and he doesn't stay on the same topic for more than, I don't know, a minute or two, and he gets bored. It doesn't matter what it is. Look, I agree with you. Whatever his advisors advise him of, it's going to have to make him look strong. It's going to have to make him look good and look smart. If it doesn't, he's going to turn it down because he won't understand anything else. Anything beyond that is too complicated. Look, Nicolas, we're in for a very, very dark time here in the United States. I don't know any other way to say it. I'm sure you've read some of the actions that Trump has already taken in the first not even 72 hours, or about 72 hours of his administration. We're in for some really, really dark times right here in the United States. And unfortunately, those dark times are going to be carried over to Ukraine and to Europe if NATO, Europe, doesn't get its act together, meaning function without Trump. Try to deal with him, try to get him on their side, but assume that they cannot, that he's not going to support NATO in the future. They need to do that now. And I don't know if I have confidence that they're going to be able to do that in the near future for all the reasons that
Yeah.
we've just discussed. Um, Last point, and then we unfortunately have to wrap this up. Do you feel, in your opinion, being an expert in this area, that Europe in general, NATO, is going to get it in the very near future, like now, this year, 2025, and be able to operate outside of the United States to protect not only Ukraine and ensure its victory, but to protect itself, to protect Europe? Or are they that stupid? And are they that corrupt? And are they that cowardly that it's just going to be a nightmare for them too? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I am always pessimistic by nature, but also by learning, and learning from history. I think that some of the European leaders know that by heart, that they have certainly to increase dramatically, I mean, the defense spending, that they have to invest, and you had certainly you heard of it, the Draghi report, things that's basically, Europe is a dwarf, in terms of investments, in terms of technology. We know since a very long time that you don't have, I mean, the US big techs or the Chinese big tech, no, that, in Europe. And because we do not invest anymore, because we do not have a real single market. We have a single market in the EU, but it's not, I mean, you still have a lot of barriers. You have of course, the idea that everyone has to basically to walk alone, in Europe, also in terms of defense. And you have a kind of suicidal behavior of most of the European leaders. And the question is that beside, I mean, the knowledge of some of the European leaders, if Europe will be able basically to get together and to have a common willingness, or if each of the European countries, or some of them at least, will will go to Mar-a-Lago and to break a kind of separate deal with Trump. That's also a risk with absolutely no interest for Ukraine. But we were mentioning Ukraine, we could mention Georgia, etc. But we have also to mention, other countries. I think that also in Asia, but also in Africa. I mean, the EU has a role to play. Just look at Africa. I don't know, of course, if Trump will maintain, his suspension of development aid, I mean, to African countries. But if he does, you know what it means. It will mean that Africa, which is still, but will become even more a very easy prey for China and for Russia, but economically, especially, of course, for China. We know also that EU has to do a lot of deals also with some of the Asian countries, not only Central Asian countries, but also, in the Southeastern Asian country. We have certainly to engage those countries to build something together to counter China, to counter partly Russia, but also to fill the void left by the US retreat from the world. And I think Europe has the ability. Just look, if we consider Europe, I mean, and by Europe, I mean the EU plus UK and Norway, not only the EU. I mean, all the military assistance provided to Ukraine from all those countries was bigger than the assistance provided by the US during the 3 last years. So we have the ability, but we have to make sacrifice. We must have visionary leaders. We don't have many. So, I mean, I have to be hopeful. I have certainly to push forward these ideas about, among the leaders whom I know. I have certainly to try, not only me, of course, many like-minded people have to do so to convince, I mean, the leaders that they have certainly to go further. Will we succeed? Still have, of course, a question mark.
Well, we never even really got to talk about Africa and China and Iran, North Korea, the Middle East, the whole situation in Gaza with Israel and so forth, which means that you're going to have to come back. So we're going to have to leave it there.
With my pleasure, certainly. Thank you very much.
Nicolas Tenzer, thank you so much. You take care, stay safe, and stay sane. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Steve. Thank you, David. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.